I didn't say a word when my son handed me the invitation. I just stood there in the doorway of his apartment, holding that envelope, reading my own name on the outside, Mr. Walter Hess, written in the kind of careful calligraphy that costs extra. He'd paid someone to write my name beautifully on an envelope that contained a letter telling me I wasn't welcome. "Dad, just read it," he said. "It's not a big deal." I read it twice. Due to the intimate nature of our ceremony, we have decided to keep the guest list to immediate family and close friends only. We hope you understand. 22 words. That's what 63 years of living, 40 of them spent raising that boy, came down to. I folded the letter back along its crease, slid it into the envelope, set it on his kitchen counter, and walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice. I got in my truck and drove the 40 minutes back to Harrisburg in complete silence, because there are moments in life when screaming would feel like a relief, and you deny yourself that relief on purpose. I want to tell you who my son is, so you understand what that moment cost me. His name is Daniel. He's 34 years old. He has my jawline and his mother's eyes, and for most of his life, that combination made him look like the kind of person people trusted on sight. I used to take pride in that. I used to think I had something to do with it. His mother, Joanne, passed when Daniel was 19, pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I won't linger on that part because even now, 14 years later, it cost me something to put it into words. What I'll say is this: after she was gone, it was the two of us, and I made a promise to her, to myself, to whatever version of God I still believed in at the time, that I would not let that boy fall apart. I kept that promise. I worked double shifts at the plant for 2 years so Daniel could finish his degree at Penn State without loans. When he graduated and moved to Philadelphia to work in finance, I drove the U-Haul myself, helped him carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs, and drove home with a sore back and a full heart. When he needed a cosigner on his first car loan because his credit was thin, I signed. When he called at 2 in the morning, confused about his 401k, I stayed on the phone for an hour even though I had to be at work at 6. I was not a perfect father. I was impatient sometimes. I worked too much when he was young. I'm not trying to paint myself as a saint, but I was there. Every time I was there. He met Natalie about 3 years ago. She's from money, old Connecticut money, the kind that comes with a family home on 2 acres and parents who talk about the shore like it's a proper noun. She's not a bad person. I want to be clear about that because this story is easy to turn into a villain and hero thing, and the truth is more complicated. Natalie is sharp, she's ambitious, and she has a very specific idea of what her life is supposed to look like. The problem is that in that picture, I didn't fit. I'm a machinist from central Pennsylvania. I own a 3-bedroom house that needs a new roof. I drive a Ford F-150 with 140,000 miles on it. My hands are rough. My dress shirts come from Kohl's. I am not embarrassing, but I am not what Natalie had in mind when she imagined a father-in-law. The first time I met her parents at a dinner in Hartford, her father spent most of the meal asking me questions that were technically polite but designed to locate me. What do you do? Where did you study? Do you have a place down the shore? He wasn't rude. He was thorough. By dessert, he'd filed me under manageable and moved on. Natalie filed me under something else. It started small. Daniel would call less. Plans would get made and then quietly unmade. When they came to Harrisburg for Thanksgiving the year before the engagement, Natalie spent most of the visit on her phone and left early with a headache. Daniel apologized for her on the drive to the airport, which was its own kind of wound, that he felt he had to choose between apologizing to me for her or defending her to me, and he'd already decided which one was easier. When Daniel called to tell me he was proposing, I felt something lift in my chest. I thought, this is the moment things reset. I thought maybe now there'd be a new chapter where I wasn't something to manage, but something to include. He asked me during that call whether I might be able to help with the wedding costs. I said yes. Of course I said yes. What I didn't say, what I'd never told Daniel because I'd been waiting for the right moment, which never came, and then became a habit of silence, was that after Joanne died, I'd gotten very careful with money. Not out of fear, but out of intention. I'd paid off the house. I'd invested quietly and consistently for over a decade. I had a financial advisor named George who called me every quarter and who had, over time, become something like a friend. I wasn't wealthy in any way that showed, but I had built something real and solid, the same way I'd built everything in my life, without announcing it. I contributed $40,000 to the wedding fund without explanation. Daniel thanked me, said that was generous, and I could hear Natalie's voice in the background saying something I couldn't make out. The engagement lasted 14 months. In those 14 months, I was invited to exactly one planning event, a brief obligatory dinner at their apartment where Natalie showed me color swatches I wasn't qualified to have opinions about. Daniel laughed too loudly at everything she said. He kept glancing at her like a student watching a teacher for approval. I drove home from that dinner and sat in my kitchen for a long time. I called my buddy Frank, who's known me since high school, who was there when Joanne and I got married, who gave the toast at her funeral that made even the funeral director tear up. I told Frank what was happening. "Walt," he said, "how much does your boy know about what you're worth?" "Nothing," I said. "Then he doesn't know what he's throwing away." I didn't sleep well that night. The invitation arrived 6 weeks before the wedding. I've already told you what it said. What I haven't told you is that when I called Daniel the next morning, he let it go to voicemail. Twice. He called back 3 hours later and opened with, "Dad, I knew you'd make this a whole thing." I said, "I'm not making anything, I just want to understand." He said Natalie felt the ceremony should be small. He said they had limited seats. He said her family was large and that they'd had to make hard choices. He said all of this in the measured, careful voice of someone who had rehearsed the conversation. He said it like he was reading a statement. I asked, "Did she ask you not to invite me, or did you decide together?" A pause, then, "It was a mutual decision, Dad." I said okay. I told him I hoped he'd be happy. I said it and I meant it, which is the part that hurt most. Not the anger, but the love that stayed underneath it. Stubborn and unconditional, and completely unwanted. I hung up and I called George. "George," I said, "I need to review a few things. Now here's what you need to understand about my money, because it matters to what comes next." When Joanne died, she had a small life insurance policy, $85,000. That was the seed. I didn't touch it for 3 years. Then I started reading. I took a community education class on investing at the local library, taught by a retired accountant who wore the same brown cardigan every week. I learned what I needed to learn. I started slow and I stayed consistent. I reinvested dividends. I didn't panic in 2008 when the market dropped and most of my coworkers were selling everything. I bought more. By the time Daniel got engaged, I had just over $1.1 million in various accounts. My house was paid off. My truck was paid off. My monthly expenses were modest. I had, in the quiet arithmetic of a careful life, become a millionaire, and nobody knew it, not even Daniel, because it had never seemed like the right thing to lead with. I had also, a few years earlier, set up a trust. George had suggested it. The trust held my investment accounts, my property, a small life insurance policy I'd kept current. I was the trustee. Daniel was the named beneficiary. At the time I set it up. When I called George after receiving that invitation, I told him what had happened. George listened without interrupting, which is one of the reasons I've kept him for 15 years. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking I'd like to revisit the beneficiary designation," I said. George was quiet for a moment. "That's your right, Walt. Take a few days before you do anything." I took a few days. Then I made the changes. The trust was restructured. The beneficiary was updated. I donated a portion to Joanne's memory, a scholarship fund at Penn State for first-generation engineering students, which felt right in a way I couldn't fully explain. The rest, I redistributed according to my own revised sense of what my life had actually meant and to whom. I sent Daniel a card for the wedding, with a check for $500 and a handwritten note that said, "I hope this day brings you everything you're hoping for." I meant that too. I did not attend. The day of the wedding, I drove up to see Frank and his wife Carol in Scranton. We sat on their back porch and ate Carol's pulled pork and watched the sun go down over the tree line and didn't talk about the wedding once. It was one of the best evenings I'd had in years. 3 months later, Daniel called. I knew from the first second of his voice that something had shifted. The rehearsed quality was gone. He sounded like himself, like the 20-year-old who'd called me from his dorm the night before his mother's funeral, not knowing what to say, just needing to hear my voice. "Dad," he said, "can I come see you?" He drove down on a Saturday. He sat at my kitchen table where he'd done homework for years, where he'd eaten 10,000 meals, where his mother used to help him with vocabulary flashcards before tests. He sat there and he told me that things with Natalie had been difficult, that he'd started to see patterns he hadn't wanted to see before, that he'd been in therapy for 2 months and his therapist had, gently and professionally, introduced him to the concept of people-pleasing and what it costs. He didn't cry, he's not a crier, like me, but he looked tired in the way that means something has been worked through. "I don't know how to apologize for what I did," he said. "You just did," I said. "Dad," he looked at the table. "I told Natalie you were struggling financially. I told her you'd basically borrowed to give us that money. I don't know why I did that. I think I was trying to manage how she saw you, and I just—" He stopped. It wasn't right. None of it was right. None of it was right. I poured us both coffee. I sat down across from him. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago," I said. I told him about the investments, about George, about the trust, about the scholarship fund at Penn State in his mother's name. I didn't say any of it to punish him or to prove a point. I said it because secrets have a cost, and I'd been paying it for long enough. He sat very still. "How long?" he said. "The investing, about 12 years. And you never said anything." I wasn't hiding it. I just never found the right moment. And then finding the right moment became not finding it. And I shrugged. It became a habit. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked about the trust, whether he was still. "I changed it," I said, "after the invitation." He nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't ask me to change it back. That, more than anything, told me that whatever work he'd been doing on himself was real. "Is there a chance?" he started. "There's always a chance," I said. "That's not off the table. But we need time. You and I need to rebuild something. That takes time." He nodded again. We talked for 4 hours that afternoon. We talked about his mother, which we almost never did, and which we probably should have been doing for years. We talked about what he remembered from being a kid. We talked about the things I'd gotten wrong and the things he had. We didn't solve anything. We didn't tie a bow on it. But when he left that evening, he hugged me at the door the way he used to when he was small. Both arms, full commitment, no half measure. I stood on the porch and watched his car back out of the driveway and disappear up the street. The money was never the point. I want to say that clearly. I didn't restructure the trust to punish my son. I restructured it because I'd looked at my life clearly and asked myself, who has shown up for me? And the answer, in that moment, was not my son. The answer was Frank and Carol, a Saturday in Scranton, pulled pork and quiet, and 40 years of friendship that never needed to be earned. The trust reflected that. Whether it would eventually reflect something else I didn't know yet. What I knew was this. I had spent 63 years building things, a career, a house, a marriage that ended too soon, a son I love more than I know how to say, a modest fortune that nobody saw coming, and I had learned, in the hardest possible way, that you cannot give people the value of what they're throwing away. They have to discover it themselves. Some of them do. Daniel calls every Sunday now. Sometimes we talk for 20 minutes, sometimes 2 hours. He started asking about the investments, not because he expects anything, he says, and I believe him, but because he's realized there are things his father knows that nobody ever thought to teach him. Last month he opened a Roth IRA for the first time. He called me after he set it up, proud of himself. The way he used to call me after Little League games when he went 3 for 4. I told him I was proud of him. I meant it completely. I'm not angry anymore. I want to be clear about that too. Anger is expensive, and I've always been careful with money. I just expect, now, to be treated like someone worth keeping. That's not a high bar, Joanne would have agreed. She used to say, and I can still hear her saying it, clear as anything, Walt, the people who love you right don't make you feel like a burden. She was right about most things. I keep the $500 card I sent to the wedding in my desk drawer, not as a reminder of the hurt, as a reminder of the man I chose to be when I could have chosen differently. I walked away with my dignity and my silence, and both of them turned out to be worth considerably more than 22 words in careful calligraphy. Some lessons arrive wrapped in grief. You carry them for a while before you understand what they are. I'm still carrying mine. But these days, it feels less like weight and more like proof that I built something real, that I loved without conditions, and that when the moment came, I let the silence speak for me. It spoke loud enough. I keep thinking about the moment I set that envelope on Daniel's kitchen counter and walked out. No raised voice, no slammed door, just the sound of my own boots on the floor and the click of a latch behind me. People sometimes ask, when they hear a story like this, why didn't you fight harder? Why didn't you demand to be heard? And I understand the question. But I've lived long enough to know that the loudest thing a person can do sometimes is leave quietly. Not out of weakness, out of a kind of clarity that only comes when you've stopped trying to earn what should never have needed earning in the first place. What I did in those months wasn't revenge. I want to be clear about that. I didn't restructure the trust to punish my son. I did it because I looked at my life honestly, which is something I'd been avoiding for a while, and asked myself what I had actually built and who I had built it for. That kind of honesty takes something. It costs you the comfortable story you've been telling yourself. But it's the only accounting that means anything in the end. There's something I've come to believe, and it has nothing to do with luck or fate or anything I can't explain. It has to do with choices that compound over time, the same way money does. Every decision Daniel made, to let Natalie's voice replace his own judgment, to present me to her as a problem to be managed, to sign his name to that 22-word letter. Those choices didn't happen in isolation. They were the result of a long, slow drift away from the things he'd been raised to understand about integrity and about family, and the consequences were just the natural end of that drift, not punishment from the universe, just math. What pulled him back wasn't fear of losing an inheritance. I truly believe that. What pulled him back was therapy, honesty, and the hard work of looking at himself without flinching. That takes a kind of courage that has nothing to do with being bold or outspoken. It's quiet courage, the kind that sits in a room with an uncomfortable truth and doesn't leave until something shifts. I watched my son find that in himself, and I'll tell you honestly, it moved me more than I expected. Joanne used to say that you can't give someone character. You can model it. You can create conditions for it, but ultimately, a person has to choose it for themselves. I spent decades trying to model it, through work, through consistency, through showing up even when it was inconvenient. I don't know how much of that landed, but I know Daniel's sitting somewhere tonight contributing to a Roth IRA he opened himself, and something in that small fact carries the whole weight of what I hoped for him. What I want, if anything, to leave with you is this: the people who endure are not the ones who never get knocked down. They're the ones who built something real before the fall. A work ethic forged early, a sense of right and wrong that holds even when it's costly, and the resilience to sit in a difficult season without letting it define you permanently. I kept all three through the hardest year I've had since losing Joanne. And I'm still standing. That's enough for me.